A former FBI agent has done something this week that no prior expert commentary in the Nancy Guthrie case has done. They have named a theory that attempts to identify the kidnapper not from psychological profiling alone, but from the specific physical choices made during the abduction itself. The theory is called the mask and hood framework, and it draws its analytical conclusions from what the kidnapper wore during the crime and what those specific concealment choices reveal about who they are. This is forensic behavioral analysis at its most specific and most direct. It moves the conversation from broad psychological categories toward concrete, identifiable characteristics of a real person. And it represents the most targeted public attempt yet to close the gap between the investigation's private knowledge and the public record. Nancy Guthrie has now been missing for 78 days. In that time, the investigation has produced DNA evidence at the FBI laboratory, 2 ransom notes, a geographic claim placing her in Mexico, a psychological profile centered on a God complex, a criminal profile noting a planned abduction, and now a theory about the kidnapper's identity rooted in the physical execution of the crime. The analytical picture is becoming more specific. The investigative picture has not yet produced the identification it is building toward. A second former FBI agent has also offered a ransom note theory this week, adding another layer to the analytical record. A third expert has shared what is described in reporting as a bombshell theory about the suspect. And a retired agent's simple motive theory has received public backing from Savannah Guthrie and her siblings, suggesting that the family's private knowledge of Nancy Guthrie's life aligns with a specific public explanation for why she was targeted. At the same time, her medication crisis deepens. 78 days without her regular medication is not a background detail. It is a medical emergency that is accumulating biological consequences in real time, independent of everything else happening in the investigation. This is where the case stands, examined through the lens of the criminal and forensic analysis it deserves. The mask and hood theory deserves the most careful examination this report can provide because it represents an analytical methodology that is both rigorous and underappreciated in public coverage of cases like this one. Forensic behavioral analysis of crime execution is a recognized discipline within investigative science. It rests on a core principle. The choices a perpetrator makes in executing a crime are not random. They reflect the perpetrator's knowledge, experience, social environment, physical capabilities, prior criminal history, and relationship to risk. By analyzing those choices systematically, an experienced analyst can build a portrait of the perpetrator that is more specific than a psychological profile and more directly investigatively actionable. The mask element of the mask and hood theory addresses one specific dimension of the abduction. A perpetrator who wore a mask during a kidnapping was anticipating the possibility of visual identification. That anticipation reflects knowledge of how investigations work, specifically the understanding that eyewitness identification and surveillance camera analysis are standard tools in any abduction investigation. Someone who has that knowledge either has personal experience with how investigations work, has researched the process, or has learned from others who have. The specific type of mask matters to the analyst beyond simply noting that concealment was used. Different types of masks are associated with different social contexts, availability patterns, and purchasing behaviors. A ski mask is associated with cold weather athletic activities. A balaclava connects to a different set of contexts. A surgical mask or cloth covering connects to others. The choice of a specific type of mask within the broad category of concealment is information about the perpetrator's lifestyle, habits, and social environment. The hood element of the theory adds a different dimension. Hooded garments are extremely common in American society. Their commonality is exactly what makes the hood element analytically significant when combined with the mask. The combination of a hood and a mask in the context of this abduction suggests someone who was willing to appear conspicuously concealed rather than casually blending in. That willingness implies either a significant degree of confidence that they would not be observed, or a social environment in which the combination is not conspicuous because it occurs naturally in the activities or contexts that characterize the person's ordinary life. The former FBI agent making big claims about the kidnapper's identity based on this theory is doing so from the position of someone who has likely analyzed multiple abduction cases where concealment choices played an evidentiary role. The confidence implicit in making specific identity claims rather than simply offering the framework suggests that the agent believes the combination of analytical dimensions in this case produces a sufficiently narrow portrait to make directional claims defensible. What the theory does not do in its public form is name an individual. The claims about identity are structural. They describe a type of person in terms specific enough to be useful for investigation without crossing the line into an accusation that would require evidentiary support to sustain publicly. The ransom note theory, offered by a second former FBI agent this week, engages the communication evidence in the case rather than the physical execution evidence, and it connects to a separate but complementary analytical tradition. Ransom note analysis has been a component of kidnapping investigations since ransom notes first appeared in such cases. Its methods have been refined significantly over the past several decades as the field of forensic linguistics has developed. Modern ransom note analysis goes well beyond the handwriting examination that characterized earlier approaches. It encompasses linguistic analysis of word choice and sentence structure, document analysis of physical characteristics, and behavioral analysis of the communication strategy implied by the note's structure and content. The two ransom notes in the Nancy Guthrie case offer something that a single note does not. They offer a comparative data set. When an analyst has two communications from the same source, they can identify patterns that are consistent across both, patterns that reflect the perpetrator's stable characteristics rather than situational choices. They can also identify differences between the two notes, differences that might reflect a change in the perpetrator's circumstances, emotional state, or strategic calculation between the time the first note was sent and the time the second note was sent. The former agent's ransom note theory this week reportedly makes claims about the identity of the kidnapper based on this kind of analysis. The combination of what is consistent across both notes and what has changed between them is the evidentiary basis for those claims. Consistent elements tell the analyst about the perpetrator's fixed characteristics. Changed elements tell them about the perpetrator's dynamic situation. If the Mexico claim in the second note is treated as a changed element, the question it poses is why the perpetrator introduced a specific geographic location in the second note that was absent from the first. What changed in the perpetrator's circumstances or strategic calculation that made including that claim seem useful or appropriate at the specific moment the second note was sent? The former agent's theory, if it addresses this question, would provide a specific window into the perpetrator's current situation and thinking. The bombshell expert theory about the suspect, described in those terms in the reporting this week, represents the outermost extent of the expert analytical contributions to the public record. The framing of bombshell implies that this theory introduces something that the prior analytical record does not contain: a new identification claim, a structural departure from the existing investigative framework, a piece of evidence or analysis that changes how the case should be understood. Without the specific content of the theory being fully accessible in the public record, this analysis can engage with what its framing tells us. A bombshell theory from an expert in a case at this stage is not background commentary. It is a directional claim about the case's trajectory. When experienced analysts offer bombshell assessments, they are typically doing so because they believe the evidence supports a conclusion that the general public and the press have not yet arrived at. The theory represents the analyst's judgment that the case is further along than its public presentation suggests. The medication crisis at 78 days is the forensic and humanitarian dimension of this case that has received the least analytical attention in standard coverage. And it is the one that may ultimately carry the most weight in understanding both the urgency and the trajectory of the investigation. Nancy Guthrie was taking medication before she was abducted. That medication was managing conditions that, in an 82-year-old person, represent ongoing clinical needs rather than temporary treatments. The conditions that elderly patients manage with regular medication are typically chronic, meaning they persist and potentially worsen without consistent pharmaceutical intervention. At 78 days without that intervention, the question is not whether her health has been affected. The question is how severely it has been affected and what the trajectory of that effect looks like going forward. From a forensic perspective, medication needs in an abduction case create a trail. Prescription medications cannot be acquired without a prescription. Prescriptions are issued by licensed medical providers and filled at registered pharmacies. Pharmacy records are accessible to law enforcement. If the person or persons holding Nancy Guthrie have attempted to acquire her medications through any legitimate channel, that attempt creates a paper trail that investigators can follow. There is also the possibility that no attempt has been made to acquire her medications, either because the kidnapper is indifferent to her medical needs or because they are unaware of what those needs are. In the first scenario, the medical consequences are accumulating deliberately. In the second, they are accumulating through ignorance. Both scenarios have implications for the nature of the captivity and for what investigators should infer about the condition in which Nancy Guthrie is currently being held. The reporting on what medication she was taking connects this dimension of the case to the direct human reality of an 82-year-old woman in an unknown location, separated from her medical care for nearly 3 months. That reality is not abstract. It describes specific biological processes occurring in a specific person's body. The specificity of what her conditions require and what the absence of treatment produces is information that frames every other aspect of the investigation with a kind of urgency that statistical analysis and expert profiling cannot fully capture. Investigators are aware of this dimension. The medical information about Nancy Guthrie is part of the investigative picture in ways that the public record does not fully reflect. Law enforcement agencies in cases involving vulnerable victims with medical needs factor those needs into their assessment of case urgency and resource allocation. The 78-day mark in the context of a specific medical profile is not simply a time marker. It is a clinical milestone with its own implications for the investigation's direction. Subscribing to this coverage is the way to stay with these developments as they continue, because the medical dimension of this case is generating reporting that will only increase in significance as the timeline extends. The retired FBI agent's simple motive theory, backed by the family, is the analytical contribution this week that carries the most direct weight for understanding the investigation's direction. Expert theories about criminal motive are common in high-profile cases. They range from highly specific and evidentiary to broadly speculative. What distinguishes the retired agent's theory from prior motive commentary in this case is a single factor: the family agrees with it. Savannah Guthrie and her siblings have publicly backed the specific motive theory that the retired agent has offered. That backing is not simply commentary agreement. It reflects that the family, in their private knowledge of their mother and her circumstances, find the theory consistent with what they know. Families of kidnapping victims know things about their loved ones that no outside analyst does. The specific details of Nancy Guthrie's relationships, her history, her finances, her social connections, and any recent events in her life that might have made her a target, all of that information lives primarily within the family. When the family endorses a specific motive theory, they are implicitly confirming that the theory is consistent with that private knowledge. The word simple in the framing of the theory is analytically significant. Simple motives in kidnapping cases typically involve one of a small number of categories. Financial motive, meaning the kidnapper targeted this victim because they believed the family could and would pay a significant ransom. Personal motive, meaning the kidnapper had a specific personal grievance against the victim or her family. Opportunistic motive, meaning the victim was selected based on vulnerability or availability rather than a specific calculated reason. The simplicity framing suggests the motive falls clearly into one of these categories, rather than involving complex, overlapping rationales. The family's backing of the theory suggests it is one they can reconcile with their knowledge of their mother's life. A financial motive would be reconcilable with the family's awareness of their own public profile and the assumption that a kidnapper might make about their resources. A personal motive would require the family to have some awareness of a person in their mother's life who might have a grievance. The fact that the family is willing to back a specific theory publicly suggests they have thought through what it implies and find it credible. Nancy Guthrie's investigation, at 78 days, is entering a phase where the analytical picture and the investigative reality are converging. The mask and hood theory provides a directional identification framework. The ransom note theory provides a communication analysis that complements it. The bombshell theory introduces a specific, dramatic claim about the suspect. And the family's endorsement of the simple motive theory provides human confirmation of the investigative framework. What remains is the final step, moving from the portrait of the suspected perpetrator that all of this analysis has been building to the identification and apprehension of the actual person. That step requires evidence that the public laboratory has to produce, or that the investigative process already running has already produced internally. At 78 days, the question of when that step arrives is the only question that matters. Every analytical theory, every expert contribution, every piece of forensic evidence in the FBI laboratory, every detention in the Tucson area, every communication from the kidnapper, every day without medication for an 82-year-old woman, all of it is pointing toward that one remaining step. The mask and hood theory operates within a broader forensic behavioral framework that is worth examining in more structural detail, because understanding the methodology behind the theory illuminates why its claims about the kidnapper's identity can be made with the degree of directness that the former FBI agent has applied. Forensic behavioral analysis of crime execution rests on what is called Locard's exchange principle in a behavioral rather than purely physical sense. The original Locard principle holds that every contact leaves a trace. Applied to criminal behavior, this means that every choice a perpetrator makes during the execution of a crime leaves a trace of the perpetrator's identity, not just in the physical evidence, but in the behavioral record of what was done and how. The concealment choices made during a kidnapping are among the most information-rich elements of that behavioral record. Concealment is not a neutral choice. It is a decision that reflects the perpetrator's knowledge of surveillance environments, their access to specific types of concealment equipment, their comfort level with appearing in public with concealment in the area where the crime was committed, and their assessment of how much concealment was necessary given the specific circumstances of the abduction. Each of those elements is a window into the perpetrator's characteristics. Their knowledge of surveillance environments reflects either direct experience with law enforcement processes, research into how investigations work, or education in contexts where that knowledge is relevant. Their access to specific concealment equipment reflects their purchasing habits, social environment, and the activities that are normal parts of their daily life. Their comfort level with public appearance in concealment reflects their relationship to the specific neighborhood or area where the abduction occurred. Their assessment of required concealment reflects their understanding of the specific evidentiary risks posed by the target location. A former FBI agent who has analyzed these elements in the context of the Nancy Guthrie abduction is not simply noting that concealment was used. They are reverse engineering the perpetrator's characteristics from the specific pattern of choices that the concealment reflects. The result is a profile that is, in the agent's assessment, specific enough to make directional claims about the kidnapper's identity. The connection between the mask and hood theory and the earlier observation that the kidnapper had a plan is direct and important. A planned abduction in which specific concealment was prepared in advance means that the mask and hood were not improvised responses to unexpected circumstances. They were prepared elements of a premeditated operation. The person who wore them had them available before the crime was committed, had thought through why they would be needed, and had made specific choices about the type of concealment that would serve their purposes. Those choices, analyzed against the behavioral record of the case as a whole, including the communication patterns in the ransom notes, the geographic claim placing Nancy Guthrie in Mexico, the extended engagement with the family, and the psychological profile suggesting a God complex, produce a picture of a specific individual whose characteristics are becoming increasingly identifiable even in the absence of a formal public identification. The ransom note theory from the second former agent completes the picture by adding the communication dimension to the execution dimension. If the mask and hood analysis describes who the kidnapper is in terms of their physical environment and preparation, the ransom note analysis describes who they are in terms of their language, their education, their relationship to authority, and their psychological needs in communication. Together, these two analytical dimensions from two separate former agents operating independently of each other compose a portrait of the suspected perpetrator that is more complete than either dimension alone could produce. The convergence of independent expert analyses on a consistent portrait of the same individual is the strongest form of expert evidence available in a case where forensic identification is still pending. When multiple experienced analysts working from different evidentiary starting points arrive at consistent characterizations of the suspected perpetrator, the probability that those characterizations are pointing in the right direction is significantly higher than if they were produced by a single analyst working with a single evidentiary object. At 78 days, the Nancy Guthrie investigation has accumulated enough analytical convergence in the expert community to describe the suspected perpetrator in more specific terms than has been possible at any prior point. That convergence is the prelude to identification. And identification, when it arrives, will be the moment that all of this analysis has been working toward.